And apparently, he really just calculates that once he comes to power, he'll make a deal with his Russian counterpart. And this approach worries me the most, because Putin is constantly talking about negotiations. Recall the Moscow-Kiev agreement that was in the works in Istanbul 2 years ago. I hope you've read the analysis of the points in this, if I may say so, document. But I'm afraid that Trump might see this as a pretty good deal. A deal that Zelensky simply won't be able to accept, which means Kiev will have its aid from Washington cut off. More than anything in the world, I would like the war to end, for Ukrainian soldiers to return to their families, and for Russian bombs and missiles to stop killing civilians. The problem is that a Putin-Trump deal doesn't provide for this. As we discussed, one of them doesn't need peace because he didn't start the war just for a few regions, and now the other has to explain why he didn't achieve this peace. So, for both of them to save face, they need to find someone to blame. Unfortunately, that turned out to be Ukraine, which will now be shaken from both sides. The goal is to weaken the undesirable side. Whether they'll do it through elections, discrediting, military terror, or all of the above, we'll see. But no matter what anyone says, know this: in any scenario, the final word belongs to the Ukrainians. That's why I decided to make this what I think is an important video, the meaning of which will become clear at the end. I'm not saying hello. Russian policy over the past 350 years has been a policy of fragmentation. Its aim has been to take away language, culture, memory, to hollow out the national spirit. Since the outcome of military confrontation is determined by spirit, if a people have it, victory will always be theirs. Viktor Yushchenko, Ukraine's third president. November 2004. The Central Election Commission of Ukraine declares Viktor Yanukovych as the winner of the presidential elections based on the results. From the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin keeps calling and congratulating his colleague on a convincing victory, hoping that these calls will somehow stop the approaching political storm. It's clear to everyone worldwide that the elections were rigged. All 25 European Union member countries are recalling their ambassadors from Ukraine in protest. The United States also does not recognize Yanukovych's legitimacy. Amid documented mass ballot stuffing, falsifications, so-called carousels, blackmailing students with expulsion threats if they didn't support Viktor Fedorovich, and intimidating election commission members, mass protests are beginning in Kyiv. People are not even stopped by the fact that Putin keeps calling Yanukovych and, with a persistence that could be put to better use, keeps congratulating him on his victory.
Anecdote: Viktor Yanukovych grew frustrated after receiving his 11th congratulatory message from Vladimir Putin following his election victory. Back off, Volodya. It turned out awkward, but our television propaganda gladly smoothed over this awkwardness, not for the first time.
Russian news about Ukraine is a reflection of some mix of envy and disbelief.
They can't have anything better than we do, and everything they do is because they've been bought.
During the 2-month election campaign, Russia's primary state channels fully supported candidate Yanukovych. They mocked Yushchenko, showing close-ups of his face in a sophisticated way. In 2004, Putin did not dare to start a war against Ukraine. At that time, he still didn't have enough strength for that. It is for this very reason that the bloodless Orange Revolution achieves its goals. And in the scheduled re-elections, he gets the victory. Viktor Andreyevich Yushchenko, the former head of the central bank, who implemented several of the most important reforms for Ukraine. They were so successful that in 1997, Yushchenko was ranked among the top 6 bankers in the world by Global Finance. Probably for this reason, his 5-year term was the most successful from the point of view of economic growth for Ukrainians. From 2004 to 2008, the country's gross domestic product grew from $67 billion to $188 billion. Direct foreign investment in Ukraine will grow by a staggering 340% in year 2005. And in just the first 3 years of Yushchenko's rule, Ukraine will receive $32 billion in investments. That's more than during the entire rule of all past and future presidents of Ukraine. Considering inflation, pensions have tripled, and real wages, adjusted for price increases, have risen by 70%. The inflation-adjusted budget has nearly doubled. Gold and foreign currency reserves have grown from $10 billion to $34.
If we recall what was happening 20 or 15 years ago, the gross domestic product growth during the so-called Orange 5-year period, let's call it that, was fourfold. People's incomes grew threefold in the first 4 years, then the global crisis hit. Total foreign investment during 5 years of Yushchenko's presidency was as much as in the previous 20 years. 2 terms of President Kuchma, the term of President Poroshenko, and Zelensky's term combined. How can you explain why the Ukrainian economy was developing at such a pace back then, and why it was not possible to repeat that success later?
Of course, the global crisis of 2008 had a very serious impact on Ukraine's economic growth, significantly slowing down the pace. However, Yushchenko managed to distinguish himself not only as a president focused on domestic issues, because Viktor Andreyevich also conducted a competent foreign policy. The course was firmly pro-European, with joining NATO declared as the primary strategic objective. Yushchenko initiates the creation of the first Ukrainian OTRK, which will later be named Sapsan. This program will be immediately shut down by his successor. If this hadn't happened, Ukraine would already have a medium-range ballistic missile system. This would have radically changed today's battlefield. It's important to note, it's often said that the first defense minister under Yushchenko, Anatoly Hrytsenko, sold more weapons than all his colleagues. This, of course, is a fact. However, it would be important here to analyze exactly what kind of equipment was exported under Hrytsenko and where it was sent. After all, the Yushchenko government is actively helping to arm Georgia, which is purchasing modernized BMPs, artillery, and anti-aircraft missile systems from Kyiv, with which it will shoot down Russian fighters, attack aircraft, and even strategic aviation.
The Russian fighter Tu-22 was shot down by a surface-to-air missile, experts have determined, and S-200 likely in service with Ukraine's air defense, one of Georgia's partners. How many such systems could have ended up in Tbilisi is unknown. Kyiv has classified information about arms deliveries, and today they have been avoiding any comments regarding their use in the fighting in Tskhinvali. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, Kyiv and Tbilisi have been closely cooperating militarily since 2005. Ukraine delivered 31 modern T-72 tanks, 20 BTRs, 40 BMPs, self-propelled howitzers, planes, and helicopters to Georgia. Georgia is reportedly using Buk and Tor anti-aircraft missile systems sourced from Ukraine against Russian peacekeepers.
Saakashvili is buying helicopters, heavy trucks, and small arms, which I discussed in an exclusive video. If you're interested, subscribe. On this matter, Yushchenko ignores the Kremlin's objections, realizing that Georgia's defense capacity aligns with Ukraine's interests. Of course, then Yushchenko will condemn the Russian invasion of Georgia, and in the midst of the war, he will go to Tbilisi together with several European leaders, where he will support the Georgian people from the podium.
Today we came here to tell you these words. Georgia is our friend. Georgians are our friends. Today, in the most difficult times for Georgia, we say that you have the right to freedom. We came to confirm that your sovereignty, your independence, your territorial integrity are our values as well.
Yushchenko, aware that Ukraine could suffer Georgia's fate, actively cooperates with NATO. During his term, the Ukraine NATO targeted plan was adopted, involving joint exercises, peacekeeping mission participation, and strengthened cooperation. However, not all of Viktor Andreyevich's policies aimed to separate from the Russian Federation. Rather, it was a cautious walk through a minefield. Yushchenko is trying to build business relations with the northern neighbor without giving him any reason to start aggression. As we will learn, in 2022, he didn't really need any reasons. Of course, the Kremlin was already starting a hybrid war against Ukraine back then, from gas wars to sponsoring separatists. After all, the first movement for the Donetsk People's Republic appeared back in 2007. It should also be noted that Yanukovych's election campaign in 2004 already aimed to divide the country. Viktor Yanukovych's campaign headquarters was filled with Russian political strategists, and the idea to split Ukraine belongs to the notorious Gleb Pavlovsky, who became the author of one of the dirtiest campaign materials of those years, a map on which Ukraine was divided into categories. The concept of the Russian Spring was being implemented well before 2014. And the Kremlin did everything to divide the unity of Ukrainians and to prevent the country from leaving its sphere of influence. And when I say everything, I mean, of course, not just political technology tricks. After the poisoning of Litvinenko, Skripal family, Navalny, and the poisoning of Viktor Yushchenko in 2004, which remains unsolved to this day, it leads to certain thoughts.
I'm sure that Russian special services are behind his poisoning, right? These are completely different things.
Are you sure about that?
Absolutely. Moreover, the MO is always the same everywhere. I'm sure of it. And Yushchenko really said that those who organized and carried out this murder are in Russia. This is an open statement from President Yushchenko.
No, Viktor Yushchenko was not the most talented politician or the greatest statesman. He made mistakes, he was often not decisive enough, and he was not always 100% effective. But the rate of economic growth and the rise in living standards under him were unprecedented for a post-Soviet country. He was the author of major economic reforms. In fact, he was the first to revive Ukrainian self-awareness. He is making attempts to reconcile Ukrainian insurgent army veterans and World War II veterans. His actions laid a solid foundation for the country's European integration. Never before had the average Ukrainian lived as well as they did under him. Regrettably, Ukraine will need significant time to regain that level of prosperity. Yushchenko was truly a knowledgeable and professional person, but he was not a populist. But a young nation with a centuries-old history wanted everything at once. In 2010, less than 6% will vote for Yushchenko. Viktor Yanukovych will return to the president's chair, and Viktor Yushchenko's farewell speech will become a prophecy for his successor and the Ukrainian nation.
January 17th, 2010 could become the day when the country is pushed in the opposite direction. I am being frank with you. We are talking about a threat to our integrity and our sovereignty. This is about the intention to reconsider and postpone our European course. Because it means our statehood, our democracy and security, your well-being and healthy life. Outside of a united Europe, Ukraine is vulnerable to any interference. We are talking about the denationalization and de-Ukrainization of our people. It's very easy to control a people who have been divided in all directions, churches, languages. Such a people, in the end, will destroy their own state themselves.
Yes, such a long introduction was necessary in order to start the main topic of today's video. The main threat to Ukraine then and now was the division of the nation. This is what Russia succeeded in back in 2010, in 2014, and I have to say with great bitterness that this is what Russia is succeeding at now. I still tend to believe that negotiations between Trump and Putin will not end with peace and solid guarantees for Ukraine. Even if the president of the Russian Federation agrees to the deployment of a European military contingent, which is still a big question. A 30,000-strong group in the rear, which, moreover, will not be covered by NATO's Article 5, is not any kind of guarantee for Ukraine and will in no way hinder the Kremlin's global plans for dominance in Europe. In theory, Putin could agree to a temporary freeze of the war, but he can only do so in one case. If he sees unrest among Ukrainians, and that it can be crystallized into the result he needs in the elections, which the American administration has recently been insisting on, whom will Russia support? On Viktor Medvedchuk, or let's say Alexei Arestovich, whom Elon Musk might start supporting on social media at some point. We'll see about that. But the main thing is that with Trump's arrival in the White House, Putin got new options for action. He can continue the war, or he can pause it in order to use the Ukrainians' war fatigue to install his own governor in Kyiv, then disarm the armed forces of Ukraine and continue with his plans. And the second option is actually preferable for him. And not because it would save the lives of soldiers in the Russian occupation army, but simply because this is something he is really good at. He really knows how and is able to work on the decomposition of society. With the Americans at least, this worked out perfectly. With the help of useful idiots and financial injections, he managed to convince the majority of the citizens of the United States of America that Ukraine has failed as a state and as a society. As an example,
I wrote on Twitter about this incredible moment when Zelensky started asking countries for donations. I mean, Ukraine is a client state of our State Department.
That was Benny Johnson, one of the most popular American political bloggers with 3 million subscribers. An investigation by the American Department of Justice, which was later confirmed by Benny himself, revealed that the blogger had a contract with a company called Tenet, from which he received money for releasing videos. The company Tenet was owned by employees of Russia Today. In just over a year, Tenet Media paid various influencers about $10 million. As the investigation found out, top bloggers such as Benny Johnson or Tim Pool, each with 1 to 4 million subscribers, received $100,000 for creating a single video. I'm saying this so you can understand just how much Russia is willing to spend to compromise Kyiv in the eyes of its allies. But of course, the main resources are spent on propaganda within Ukraine itself. There's a huge number of promoted narratives being spread through various information channels or public opinion leaders. But actually, if you analyze all these theses a bit, their main concept boils down to a simple formula, which was perfectly and simply formulated by senior lieutenant of the Israel Defense Forces and analyst Igal Levin.
Russian information psychological special operations is manipulating you, turning your successes into failures. Now, do you understand how it's done in Russia? That anything's at all. For example, we produce 20 Bodin vehicles, right? If it weren't for corruption, we could produce 40 Bodin vehicles, right? We entered Kushchina, but if we had entered in year 23rd, we would have captured Belgorod and beyond.
Yes, this is really the simplest and most importantly, the most effective formula. Always talk about the fact that Ukraine could have achieved much more in the fight against corruption, military reforms, and economic resilience. If it didn't achieve it, then it's a failed state. Meanwhile, the crucial aspect is being disregarded. Do we have an example of a more successful resistance than what Ukraine has demonstrated? Resistance against a nuclear power, the world's second largest army, with, let's be honest, relatively modest support from the West. And now, understand me correctly, could the Ukrainian government apparatus have acted more effectively? Of course. Could it have fought corruption more actively? Of course. Could the command of the Ukrainian Defense Forces have corrected mistakes more quickly? Of course. The only question is how you continue to develop your thoughts after you acknowledge the shortcomings. Either you say that Ukraine has failed as a state, or you want to highlight the problem in order to solve it. And if it's the first, then it means you're working for the Kremlin. After all, the thesis about a failed state not only leads to Ukraine's destruction, which pleases the Kremlin, but is also completely unfounded. After all, again, you need to compare it to something. Let's try to do that.
On Wednesday in Athens, protesters hurled objects at police amidst clouds of black smoke and tear gas in the streets. Greek authorities reported that 3 people died in a bank building set ablaze by angry protesters.
2009 Greece. A new government comes to power, led by Georgios Papandreou, and makes a shocking statement. The real budget deficit of the country is not the officially stated 6 to 8%, but 12 to 13% of gross domestic product. And the country simply plunged into an abyss. Investors are massively starting to pull out of the economy, and Greek bonds are being dumped en masse. The gross domestic product of the country from 2009 to 2015 dropped by 35%. Unemployment in the hardest years reached 28%, and among young people, it went up to 50%. Such a prolonged crisis was made worse by the fact that political parties were constantly in conflict. The stumbling block was the reforms that urgently needed to be implemented, but the Greeks themselves, accustomed to a comfortable life, refused to endure unpopular measures. Because of this, the country was swept by ongoing protests, riots, and periodic looting.
In Parliament, Prime Minister Georgios Papandreou condemned the demonstrators' actions as senseless violence. Every citizen has the right to participate in demonstrations, but no one has the right to commit violence. Widespread riots have disrupted daily life nationwide. Schools, hospitals, stores are shuttered, and flights are cancelled. The unrest started during a 2-day workers' strike. Many residents of Greece are dissatisfied with the harsh economic measures that the government was forced to adopt in accordance with the conditions set by the European Union countries and the International Monetary Fund. Foreign donors are requesting government spending cuts in return for providing Greece with $145 billion in anti-crisis aid.
The country only emerged from the crisis in 2019. Do you understand now? Every time I hear Russian propagandists talk about Ukraine's insolvency, as a person who is capable of analytical thinking, I have to analyze this claim by conducting a comparative analysis. Here, we have the example of Greece, which did not lose 20% of its territory along with its largest enterprises. It did not experience a massive population outflow. It did not have to supply a million-strong army, and its people did not have to sit under bombs without electricity. And the result was that in Greece, there were mass strikes, looting, and a continuous economic decline. At the same time, Ukraine, after the fall of gross domestic product in just 1 year, not in 6 years like Greece, but in 2022, and already in the next, 2023, showed economic growth of more than 5%, despite losing 29% in a year. You understand that this is an absolute phenomenon. Of course, there will be some smart guys now who will write about how the deficit of the Ukrainian budget was covered by large financial injections from the West. My dear friends, the amount poured into the Greek economy is something Ukraine could only dream of. Athens received $320 billion from the European Union to overcome the crisis. But the most crucial aspect is the outcome. Greece's gross domestic product remains significantly below its 2009 level. But Ukraine is close to returning to the level of gross domestic product it had in 2021. Note that I'm counting all of this in dollars, not in hryvnia, which has significantly dropped in value. And nevertheless, I want to draw your attention to how the societies and state systems of the two countries coped during the crisis period. Ukraine's banking system continued to function even in the initial days of the invasion without major bank collapses. In contrast, Greece's banking sector was reduced from 40 to 20 major banks following their financial crisis. All insolvent banks had to merge with more stable colleagues, and the deficit had to be covered by loans from the European Union.
Financial operations are running normally. Mobile banking, transfers, terminal payments, and cash withdrawals are available with daily limits of up to 100,000 hryvnias. In most banks, you can buy foreign currency in cash, but only up to the equivalent of 30,000 hryvnias. Ukrainians are not afraid to keep their money in the bank because during the period of martial law, the government guarantees 100% compensation of deposits. All credit cards have been unblocked, and Ukrainians can use their money according to their limits. Most banks are honoring the promised credit holidays. In March, no interest was charged, and for April and May, the interest rate on credit cards was reduced by half.
Ukrainians did not panic, and there was no looting, unlike the Greeks. Of course, you might say that comparing an economic crisis and a war is irrelevant. I absolutely agree. Because war, especially a war with a nuclear state, is a much more difficult challenge for society and the state structure than an economic crisis. And we are not comparing the processes themselves, but rather how successfully the state and, most importantly, society respond to them. And no matter what anyone says, the reaction of Ukrainian society to the most terrible war since World War II is the clearest example of how much the Ukrainian nation has matured.
Looters have become more active in Turkey. Entire families are going out to do it. They take things, food, and anything even slightly valuable from stores and abandoned apartments. People say they're just trying to survive. However, there are also those for whom nothing is sacred. They take jewelry off the bodies of the dead. Business owners are hurriedly taking out their goods, hoping to save at least something. Men are guarding the area. Military patrols have appeared. Looters are even raiding vehicles with humanitarian aid, which they later sell at inflated prices. Over the weekend, there were reports of shelling of a humanitarian convoy.
And once again, when I listen to Russian propaganda from various media personalities like Solovyov, Dugin, or Latinina, who aggressively or subtly try to instill in Ukrainians a sense of inferiority about the inadequacy of their nation, I immediately remember a simple video showing lines at Ukrainian stores in the first days of the war. Actually, it's amazing that the stores were open at all, but indeed they were open. There were no serious shortages of products anywhere. Again, there was no panic, let alone looting, because if you tried to steal something, you could end up without your pants taped to a tree. At the same time, I remember how a huge number of Turks immediately went to loot the homes and stores of their fellow countrymen, taking advantage of the natural disaster, the earthquake that happened in 2023. And this was mass looting, not just a few isolated cases. I don't know what science and by what criteria measures the well-being of a nation, but if such a science existed, I'm sure that the main measure of well-being would be how society reacts to terrible shocks.
But in those October days, the leadership wasn't planning to hold out until the end, but acted on the principle of every man for himself. People saw that the leaders were packing up their belongings and running away. On the afternoon of October 16th, chaos erupted in the city. Store windows were shattered and warehouse doors were broken into.
Moscow presented a sorry sight that day. It was as if a wild frenzy had seized everyone and everything. And the city, where there wasn't a single enemy soldier yet, where no one was shooting, suddenly decided to end itself all at once. Looters appeared, robbing stores, banks, and savings offices. Out of 438 enterprises, institutions, and organizations, 779 managers fled. The flight of certain managers of enterprises and institutions was accompanied by large-scale embezzlement of material assets and the squandering of property. During these days, 1,484,000 rubles in cash were stolen, and valuables and property worth 1,051,000 rubles were taken. Hundreds of passenger cars and trucks were stolen. If the Germans had known the situation in Moscow on October 16th, they could have captured the city with just 500 men. Trials and executions of those who had fled began. Vladimirskaya Highway is closed to private vehicles.
Everything is known by comparison, including society's well-being. Of course, comparing different eras is a sign of a lack of historicism. But still, the fact that in order to restore order in Moscow at the moment when the Nazis were approaching the city, it was necessary to execute people, while in Kyiv it was enough to tie a few drug addicts to a tree, makes you think. Of course, it's important to acknowledge that the effect of unity in Ukrainian society, although it lasted for quite a long time, eventually began to decline due to the hardships of war. It's unwise to blame people for this natural reaction. The key point is to highlight the following. What role did Russian propaganda play in this process, which deliberately exaggerates the real problems of the Ukrainian state? And of course, the main element that Russian propaganda uses as a basis for dividing Ukrainian society has become the corruption that exists in Ukraine. Without downplaying this problem, here's what's important to say. Since we started talking about the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, there's a very important historical note.
In 1944, Dmitry Felmonov, the Central Committee representative of the All-Union Communist Party in Minsk, sends a report to Georgy Malenkov, the Central Committee Secretary of the All-Union Communist Party.
Recently, a large number of industrial goods, items, and gifts have been arriving from abroad. The local Red Cross warehouses have received a total of 20 rail cars of goods weighing 250 tons. An additional 30 rail cars are currently en route. But from the goods received, the most needy residents of Belarus have received practically nothing. From the very beginning, the accounting and storage of the items received were handled irresponsibly. They gathered 11 people from different institutions, including 8 salespeople from the city food trade. They called everyone a so-called government commission and began distributing goods among party officials. And to give it out on special terms, that is for money. The wife of Nikifor Natalevich, the head of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic and chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, was among the most frequent visitors to the Red Cross warehouse. Due to the widespread theft of Western humanitarian aid, almost no one will face consequences, with only Natalevich receiving a reprimand. In 1945, it was established. The Administration of Affairs of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Belarus unlawfully bought a substantial quantity of furniture for personal use from commission stores in Moscow and the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic, for Ponomarenko-Piquet, Kiselev N.V., and other leading party officials of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. According to preliminary data, a total of 779,578 rubles were spent for these purposes. The amounts were spent on crystal and porcelain items, on finishing dachas with red wood, and so on. To meet the personal needs of party officials of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. The inspection revealed instances of civilian aircraft being used to transport trophy property from Germany and Poland. Only in year 45, 12 flights were made, transporting several tons of cargo, including 1,600 kilograms of carpets.
From the Politburo decision of February 1942, it became known that Georgy Ivanovich Kulik, while at the front, systematically engaged in drunkenness and led a debauched lifestyle. Abusing his rank as Marshal of the Soviet Union and Deputy People's Commissar of Defense, he engaged in self-supply and embezzlement of state property, squandering hundreds of thousands of rubles from state funds. In light of all this, the Politburo of the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party resolves to remove Kulik from the post of Deputy People's Commissar of Defense of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic.
Specifically, it looked like this. Instead of flying to Kerch by plane, Kulik made his way there by car through impassable roads, as a result of which he lost 2 priceless days. Later, it turned out that Grigory Kulik had sent his plane to Sverdlovsk, where the marshal's wife and children were living in evacuation. Investigators determined the groceries on board were purchased at the Krasnodar military store. Kulik was to depart for Kerch from Krasnodar. For him, in October to December of 1941, goods worth more than 85,000 rubles were taken. Chairman Tyulyaev of the Regional Executive Committee ordered the military store to pay wholesale prices for the goods taken and attribute the expenses.
Due to his good relationship with Stalin, Kulik only receives a temporary demotion in rank after being moved to the rear account of the front. In 1943, he is again given command of an army, only being arrested in 1947. But not for corruption or for his brainless orders, but because he starts to criticize Iosif Vissarionovich. You might ask, what was the point of this historical reference? I just wanted you to realize one simple truth. No matter what kind of war it is, even when it comes to the threat of the absolute extermination of nations, extermination in the physical sense, even such a war is not an inhibitor of human vices. On the contrary, the level of corruption always, at all times, increases during any war. This applies even to existential wars. I'm leaving a link to the work The Art of the Bribe, Corruption Under Stalin, written by historian James Heinzen, where thousands of examples of corruption schemes during and after World War II are collected. There are schemes compared to which the ones in the investigations by Anti-Corruption Foundation Biggest Info will seem like harmless pranks to you. And don't think that this kind of behavior is characteristic only of our region. The United States Government Commission for overseeing the allocation of funds for the reconstruction of Afghanistan discovered $10 billion that were lost due to embezzlement, fraud, and abuse. According to some estimates, the total amount of alleged embezzlement in the American army could reach up to $150 billion during the period of the Afghan war. You might suspect I'm leading this to the following point. If corruption is an eternal companion of war, then the corruption schemes that exist in Ukraine, that is currently in war, are normal. God forbid you think that way. That's not what this is about at all. Yes, war is a catalyst that turns the brave into heroes and scoundrels into complete bastards. I'm only talking about how news about corruption in a country defending itself from aggression is presented to you. If Ukrainian investigative journalists publish data about shady schemes and point out the problem in order to solve it and prevent it from happening again, this is an absolute good for society and for the country. But if corruption is presented to you as proof of the country's absolute incompetence, if you hear narratives like, "Oh, where have you ever seen people stealing in a country at war? That's a failed state. The country is a complete mess, not even a real state." If you hear this, know that you're dealing with a Kremlin propagandist.
By pumping Ukraine with weapons, the West has turned the country into one of the largest black markets in the world. Military personnel and territorial defense fighters prove to be resourceful entrepreneurs. Instead of fighting, they are selling the assault rifles, grenade launchers, and ammunition issued to them.
Western models of combat weapons are increasingly turning up not in Ukraine, but for example in Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands.
And what is actually happening with the weapons that do make it to Ukraine? As it turns out, it often ends up surfacing on the darknet. That's a kind of shadow internet where things like this are sold. There are dozens of ads, firearms, grenades, even javelins. You can buy whatever you want.
Of course, it doesn't hurt to take a closer look at what's already happening with the weapons currently in Ukraine. The same Stingers and Javelins, they're already on the black market.
You remember, of course, how those Z-scum were spreading this narrative at the beginning of the war, about how all the Western weapons coming into Ukraine are immediately resold on the black market. Everyone was shouting about it from Solovyov to Lavrov, and then suddenly this narrative just disappeared somewhere. But why? The occupiers had to flee from the Kyiv, Chernihiv, Sumy and Kharkiv regions, as well as Kherson. They struggled for months to capture small settlements. And the claim about reselling weapons started to look really ugly. Because it turned out that Ukrainians, even fighting with sticks, since they supposedly sold all their weapons on the black market, still managed to kick the ass of the world's second best army. And here, of course, it would be necessary to talk about the scale of corruption, but I really don't want to do that. No matter what I say, I'll be accused of siding with either Zelensky's government or his opponents. But my task is different. I just want to demonstrate how you should treat the information being presented. There are problems with corruption in Ukraine, and it needs to be fought against more harshly because it seriously weakens the state. All of these are facts. The main thing is that the conclusion, after acknowledging these facts, should be constructive, not destructive, which is exactly what the Kremlin desperately wants. And if anyone shouldn't be talking about Ukrainian corruption, it's definitely the Kremlin. After all, if we judge by the only indicator that, while perhaps not the most relevant, still tracks the level of corruption in countries, the Corruption Perceptions Index, the picture is as follows. Ukraine ranks 104th place out of 180 countries in this index, which is very disappointing. However, since the war began, Ukraine has even managed to slightly improve its position in this indicator. After all, in 2022 it was ranked 116th and now it's 104th, right in between Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Since the full-scale invasion began, Russia has fallen from 137th to 141st place in the ranking. And now it is between Uganda and Kyrgyzstan. Once again, I address Ukrainians. Yes, the problem exists and it is terrible. Yes, you can't call the methods of fighting corruption in Ukraine super effective. All of this is true, However, Russian propagandists should not be discussing this issue. And to fight corruption, you don't need to surrender Ukraine to Putin. That's how it is.
We are a state that has completely lost its sovereignty.
This is another painful topic, pushed by those who benefit from the disintegration of Ukrainian society. Can we say that Ukraine has lost its sovereignty because its economy relies on subsidies and its army is fighting thanks to the help of its allies? Well, considering that 70% of Russian military equipment is now being destroyed by first-person view drones assembled in Ukraine, talking about a complete loss of sovereignty is at the very least inappropriate. Now about Western financial subsidies. European and American injections make up 15% of Ukraine's entire budget, which is undoubtedly a very significant help. But is this truly a total absence of subjectivity? It's debatable. It just raises the question. If the inability to independently defend oneself against a nuclear power means a lack of sovereignty, then which countries actually have it at all? That's literally about a dozen countries. China, India, the United States of America, Pakistan, maybe Turkey, Brazil, and who else? No, sovereignty is actually a very broad concept. Personally, for me, one of the main signs of its existence is the ability to promote your own interests beyond the borders of your country. And here, if in the previous sections I acknowledged Ukraine's problems and inefficiency in various issues, here I insist. Kyiv was able to achieve results that even the most ardent patriots of Ukraine could not have imagined. Let me explain now. In 2023, I made an exclusive video about Ukrainian main intelligence directorate specialist in Sudan containing complex material on the root causes of the country's conflict. If you're interested, subscribe. But to put it briefly, until recently on one side, there were militants supported by Russia fighting there, and the recognized government, which was supported by Ukraine. Following a meeting between Zelensky and Sudan's leader Abdel al-Burhan, Ukrainian special forces arrived in Sudan. Media outlets subsequently released videos of operations by Ukraine's main intelligence directorate in the African nation. In 2023, al-Burhan faced a disastrous situation. Pro-Russian militants nearly seized the state capital but abruptly slowed their advance following the arrival of Ukrainian special forces. Unknown, first-person view drones played a crucial role in the significantly increased strikes against militants. By the end of 2024, government forces even began to push militants out of several important settlements. And here's the thing, the Kremlin, realizing that the forces of the supported Wagner group were losing, immediately changed their approach and began to support the recognized government of Burhan, even starting to supply them with weapons. Funny and cynical, right? But that's the reality. The Kremlin must maintain its presence in Africa. That's precisely why Moscow wants to build a naval base in Sudan in exchange for supplying weapons. There are now agreements about its construction, but it's premature for Kremlin supporters to celebrate. The Kremlin made exactly the same move in Syria, trying to negotiate an extension of the agreement on the use of the naval base after the overthrow of Bashar Assad. And it seems that the renewed Damascus even made contact. However, on February 18th, it became known that some unknown individuals attacked the Russian base using drones. So we'll see how events unfold in Sudan after al-Burhan's victory, especially since they've been talking about the Russian naval base in this country since 2020. I think this time everything will fall apart again, although it will depend on the reaction of United States of America. However, the focus here is not geopolitics, but the fact that Ukraine, despite its limited resources and Putin's view of it as not a real country, is once again participating in such global processes while at war. Just 10 years ago, it would have been impossible to even imagine something like this, and now here we are. Now we somehow calmly accept the fact that Ukrainian specialists helped organize a military operation for the Syrian opposition, which ended with the overthrow of a dictator. A regime on which Russia, by the way, spent at least $500 billion rubles. But that's not all. I also shared this on my Telegram channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, I highly recommend doing so. I showed an interesting article from a Spanish publication titled Tuareg Rebels, Ukraine's allies in the fight against the Russian government in Mali, freed a Spanish hostage. There are unconfirmed reports that Ukrainian special forces, in addition to those from Sudan and Syria, are present in Mali. But the most interesting thing is the tone in which the news is presented. Now, the Tuaregs are not Islamist militants. but good allies of Ukraine who are fighting against Russian influence and helping to rescue Spanish citizens. That is, this name demonstrates that now Ukraine is perceived in Spain as a counterbalance to Russian influence in Africa. Tell me, could you have imagined something like this just 10 years ago? And that's not all.
A powerful explosion went off in the center of temporarily occupied Berdyansk. The car of the so-called military commandant of the city was blown up into the air.
A homemade explosive device went off when Lieutenant General Kirillov and his assistant were leaving the entrance of this building.
They blew up the collaborator who held the position of deputy so-called head of the Department of Internal Policy, Igor Telegin.
The body of Ilya Kiev, a fugitive ex-deputy of the Verkhovna Rada, was found in the Moscow region. In multiple Russian-controlled Ukrainian cities, representatives of the occupying authorities were killed.
Ivan Sushko was killed by a car explosion in the temporarily occupied settlement of Mikhailovka near Zaporizhzhia. In a similar incident, Alexander Kolesnikov, the so-called deputy head of the traffic police, died in the Berdyansk hospital.
In Moscow region, Mikhail Shatsky, designer of the Ka-59 and Ka-69 cruise missiles, was killed.
Reports of Ukrainian special services eliminating Russian military criminals or high-ranking officials deep behind enemy lines have become commonplace. For us, this already seems like something taken for granted, but in reality, it is also a phenomenon. Just think, a country where about 10 years ago, the special services were almost openly run by Russian agents. Until 2014, Alexander Yakimenko was head of Ukraine's security service. He fled to Russia and is now the Gauleiter of occupied Kherson region. Ukraine's former Minister of Internal Affairs under Yanukovych, Zakharchenko, fled to Russia and, during the height of the invasion, called his former colleagues to defect to the aggressor's side. Yanukovych's defense minister, Dmitry Solomatin, also escaped to Russia. After his escape, the prosecutor's office discovered that Solomatin had embezzled $560 million from the Ukrainian army. This only includes ministers and security agency heads. If we tried to list all the Federal Security Service agents who held leadership positions in Ukraine, there wouldn't be enough time to name them all. But that's not what I'm discussing now. I would like to understand how it happened that in 10 years, Ukrainian special services could reach the level of the Israeli Mossad. And this isn't just said for effect. You won't be able to give a single other example from history where a country at war was able to carry out such a number of eliminations behind enemy lines. This is unprecedented. At the same time, you have to take into account that Ukrainian special services are carrying out their operations not against some poorly trained militants in the desert and not with the help of high-precision drones. They are opposed by objectively one of the most powerful and dangerous special services in the world. Meanwhile, Russian agents failed to match the achievements of their Ukrainian counterparts. Therefore, it's kind of silly to talk about a complete lack of sovereignty when Ukraine has such tools in its arsenal, which it uses clearly without coordinating with any of its Western colleagues. You understand that the intimidated West would never have given the green light to eliminate Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov with the help of a drone.
We have to think of Ukraine's defense industry as part of our own defense industry, and that's exactly why we involved Ukraine in preparing our own defense industry strategy. This is the first step that should lead to the integration of Ukraine into some of our defense programs.
If you try to somehow measure such an ephemeral concept as sovereignty, then first of all, you need to calculate the proportions of one state's dependence on another. And Ursula von der Leyen's speech is a reminder of the fact that the European Union needs Ukraine only slightly less than Ukraine needs the European Union. And their decision to allocate $6 billion to Kiev after Donald Trump comes to the White House is the best evidence of that. Europe already needed a capable Ukraine that separates it from Russia. But after J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Forum, this is now a matter of survival. So, once again about sovereignty. Its main components for any country are, of course, the army and the state's economy. Is it even worth discussing the combat capability of Ukrainian military forces in detail here? Since the Cold War, Russia has followed the doctrine of deep operations in the event of a war with NATO. Its backbone was a massive armored tank force that was supposed to roll through Europe like a steamroller. But, for the first time in modern history, the greatest tank power is no longer Russia, but the United States of America. Yes, now the Russian Federation ranks third in the world in terms of the number of tanks after United States of America and China, and India is already breathing down its neck. But that's only if we count the number of armored boxes themselves. Considering the research of Sinter, HIMARS, Jompi and Covert Cabal, there are less than 3,500 tanks left at storage bases in Russia, of which 1,200 are beyond restoration and 2,000 are in very poor condition. And only less than 300 are still capable of performing combat missions. Just a note, of course, we're talking only about storage bases. The primary armored vehicles of Russia are currently deployed at the front lines, and this information is not Ukrainian disinformation. More and more often, the assault actions of the occupation army are carried out without heavy armor, and in some directions, they are simply using regular cars that haven't even been painted in khaki. So the third place on the list of tank superpowers is very conditional. So the question is, who else on planet Earth besides Ukraine has such a guarantee of sovereignty? That destroyed the armored tank fist of the world's second army, which, according to the doctrine developed in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was supposed to march all the way to the English Channel.
Warsaw is too easy. It's only 1,300 kilometers from Moscow to the Polish capital. The T-90 tank without transport aviation can reach the suburbs within a day of beginning its march. By that time, the airborne troops, who only need 2 hours to redeploy, will have time to rehearse, rest, cook a festive porridge with stew, and iron their dress uniforms. It's been a while since we visited Berlin. May 9th would be a perfect time for a friendly trip. 1,800 kilometers is no distance for a modern army. Many Russian officers know Germany well and won't even need a map there. The priority is to prevent them from automatically occupying our former military towns, which went to the Germans after the Federal Republic of Germany and German Democratic Republic unified. Prague, Helsinki, Vilnius, Tallinn, Riga, they're all nearby. Half of these cities, festive Russian soldiers could reach even just on foot.
Yes, in reality, it turned out, of course, a bit more modest. Most of the entire armored tank potential of the Russia's armed forces has been destroyed in a strip 30 to 50 kilometers wide in several Ukrainian regions. Of course, in such a situation when, once again, I just want you to realize, in some directions, Russian armed forces are storming positions using cars. In such a situation, it would be the greatest crime in human history if Trump tried to make a deal with Putin by fulfilling the main wishes of the dictator. Wishes about disarming Ukrainian armed forces without any security guarantees. But we are not just conducting a superficial analysis of Ukraine's sovereignty, because as we mentioned above, Kyiv's ability to resist betrayal from Donald Trump will depend precisely on whether it has that sovereignty. And now we need to talk about the second pillar of any statehood, the economy of Ukraine. And here too, things are not as straightforward as they might seem at first glance.
The Ukrainian economy is practically bankrupt. Ukraine is facing default. Ukraine has finally become a bankrupt country.
Recognition of Ukraine as bankrupt.
Ukraine's financial collapse is approaching. Now Ukraine is actually a bankrupt state.
Ukraine's economy is on the verge of collapse. Ukraine's treasury is empty.
Ukraine is on the brink of bankruptcy.
Ukraine has in fact already defaulted.
This state is bankrupt. It is bankrupt in every sense.
Who needs and why would anyone need the bonds of a state that is on the verge of bankruptcy?
Yes, that's an interesting question from the NTV channel. The country is bankrupt. Everything has been stolen and sold off. But Putin is ready to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of Russians just to keep bankrupt Ukraine in his sphere of influence. The worst part is that if it weren't for his fanatical desire, Ukraine would not only be a peaceful country, but a gradually developing state, despite all the forecasts of Kremlin propagandists. After all, in the official report of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, it is noted that even during the war, Ukraine's macroeconomic indicators are more stable than expected. Ukraine's economy is demonstrating resilience amid recovery. Simultaneously, financial stability was maintained due to Ukraine's competent official policies and substantial external support for the country. Yes, of course, I understand how this sounds to the average Ukrainian citizen who isn't looking at International Monetary Fund reports or gross domestic product figures, but at his own wallet. He realizes he has become much poorer since the full-scale invasion began. I'm not trying to convince anyone that everything is great and everyone is rich. No, I just want you to realize, even using the example of Greece, which we talked about earlier, that Ukraine, under the conditions of a terrible war, constant shelling, destruction of enterprises and mass population outflow, is holding its ground, including on the economic front, which is noted by experts from the International Monetary Fund. Since the start of the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, all banks have remained open and pensions are still being paid. The hryvnia depreciated only by 1.5 times during the worst war since World War II, which is a less severe drop compared to the Turkish lira, which fell 4 times over the same period amidst only economic instability, without a war. I repeat this several times in this segment to be properly understood. I'm not trying to justify the large number of ineffective or even harmful initiatives of the Ukrainian economic bloc. My task, taking a step back, is to look at the situation not through the prism of political preferences, but through comparative analysis, how Ukraine is holding up on the economic front. And I can say with confidence that this is not the worst result. Ukraine's gold and foreign currency reserves are now at $43 billion, even higher than before the war started, compared to $31 billion in 2021, which allows them to keep inflation in check. In 2023, it was 5%, and in 2024, it was 12%. That's a lot, but consider a few points. First of all, inflation is a global trend, and many countries are facing it. Inflation rates are as follows. Belgium is 4.4%, Romania 5.8%, Turkey 44%. Russia's inflation is only a bit lower, 7% in 2023 and 9.5% in 2024. Yes, these numbers don't comfort Ukrainians, but I'm not trying to feed you with these figures in the literal sense of the word. Just take note that with the help of the West, Ukraine was able to keep its economy from going bankrupt, something that Russian well-wishers had predicted for it.
Earlier, I showed you indicators that demonstrate the growth of Ukraine's gross domestic product after the severe decline in the first year of the full-scale invasion.
But moreover, in 2025, Ukraine has every chance to return to its pre-war gross domestic product figures, up to $200 billion. Western investments in Ukraine's military-industrial sector are partly responsible for the current situation. However, if you analyze the industrial production index, you will see that after the terrible decline in 2022, not only the gross domestic product is recovering in Ukraine. This encompasses processing, light industries, chemicals, instrument engineering, and information technology. Yes, even information technology firms have expanded. For example, the Ukrainian giant SoftServe, which employs 12,000 people, grew both in 2022 and in 2023, earning a revenue of $1 billion. Ukraine's information technology services export decreased following the full-scale invasion, but only slightly. In 2023, Ukraine received about $6.7 billion from the sale of information technology services, compared to $7 billion in 2021. For comparison, before the war, Russia exported information technology services worth $8.6 billion, but today it's only $3.3 billion. It's not about highlighting how dire the situation is in Russia. I gave these figures to once again show what kind of future Russia has taken away from Ukraine. Russia not only isn't living properly itself, it doesn't let others live either.
Dear information technology specialists, you are socially underdeveloped. What do they need? Maybe I'm oversimplifying things. A room. A computer that functions continuously with a stable power supply, internet connection, and instructions. And it's it. They are being socially isolated. You are godless, guys.
Ukraine's economic structure has evolved over an extended period. Ukraine has lost a portion of its metallurgical, mining and processing industries due to the seizure or destruction of crucial enterprises by the Russian Federation in the occupied territories. At the same time, during the war, Ukraine has developed a new sector of the economy. I am, of course, talking about the military-industrial complex. According to the Financial Times, Ukraine can already export defense products abroad worth up to $20 billion. Currently, the export of these products is limited by legislation, but if the ban is lifted, this will become a new major cluster of Ukraine's economy. For comparison, before the full-scale invasion, Ukraine exported metal products worth $15 billion. Most importantly, there are markets for these products. NATO members who are increasing their defense spending will clearly not be against purchasing Ukrainian products that have proven their effectiveness in combat. In fact, according to the head of the German defense industry giant Rheinmetall, the company has already launched one plant, a second is on the way, and 2 more are in the pipeline. This implies that Ukraine's military industry will be a key driver of its economy. British Aerospace Systems, German Flensburger Fahrzeugbau, and French Thales have already entered the Ukrainian market, opening enterprises and service centers.
And this is not just an attempt to help Ukrainians resist aggression.
This is an understanding that the competencies of Ukrainian enterprises, combined with Western technologies, can yield good results. Of course, the recovery of the Ukrainian economy will depend on how and under what conditions peace or a truce will be concluded. Will the Putin-Trump plan to establish a pro-Kremlin regime in Kyiv work or not? I just want, when the destabilization of Ukrainian society begins from both sides on the topics of corruption, inefficiency, and the bankruptcy of the economy, for you to perceive this information not through emotions. Ukraine was underestimated by Putin, underestimated by the allies. Now it is being underestimated by a former ally in the person of Trump. But the most important thing is that Ukrainians themselves do not underestimate themselves at the decisive moment. That's exactly why I made this video today. After all, of course, behind the results of all these achievements, behind the resilience in the face of a challenge that no other country in the world has faced when a nuclear monster attacks it, behind all of this, and I'm not afraid to use this word success, stands the ordinary Ukrainian. And only he has the ability, by turning over the chessboard, to once again change the course of history.
Ukrainian society knows very well what Russian occupation is. This may not be entirely clear to people from the outside. The international community thinks that Russian occupation is simply taking one national flag and replacing it with another national flag. But Ukrainian society understands very well that Russian occupation means forced disappearances, torture, rape, the forced adoption of your own children, the erasure of Ukrainian identity, filtration camps, and mass graves. This is the true nature of Russian occupation?
The scariest question that every Ukrainian or anyone who supports Ukraine is afraid to ask themselves is, was it all for nothing? Was it all in vain? The people fighting, enduring hardships and dying? I'll be honest, I don't know. But I'm sure of only one thing. No one on planet Earth knows the answer to this question. The Russian occupation is really not about changing the flag, Russian language schools, or Lenin monuments. At the very least, the residents of Bucha, Irpin, Izium, Kherson, and dozens of other cities that have not yet been liberated can confirm this. Would other Ukrainian cities have avoided the same fate if there had been a capitulation in February of 2022? I'll say this, to me that seems unlikely. And now Putin, who couldn't defeat the Ukrainians on the front lines, will try to do it from behind the lines. First, by dividing, sowing discord and demoralizing, and then, apparently, by forcing in early elections to sign a capitulation, choosing someone like Medvedchuk or a more compromised figure who would satisfy both Trump and Putin. A figure who, at some point, will sign the Istanbul peace agreement and, by fulfilling its terms, will disarm the army, reduce its numbers, and renounce any ties with military alliances. The most frustrating thing is that such a scenario would quite suit the current White House administration. After all, Trump promised peace, and he will bring it. But the fact that this peace comes through occupation doesn't concern him. We predicted this with you 8 months ago. And of course, a pause during which Ukraine will be disarmed will suit Putin just fine, because it will make it easier for him to carry out his plans. Only a fool could believe that he would abandon his intentions. Once again, he didn't start the war for the sake of a few pieces, a few regions. You might say that all of this is impossible, that Ukrainians would never choose a Kremlin-backed candidate. And I will say that a weary people who are being pressured from all sides, from Russia, America, from various European countries, from China, with the help of various influence agents, social networks owned by billionaires, might simply end up so disunited that the candidacy of someone like Medvedchuk could just emerge on its own. So this whole video was dedicated to just one thing: to warn people who will soon be bombarded with megatons of propaganda claiming that Ukraine has failed as a state, that everything about it is wrong compared to normal countries, that it's a failed state, and so on. To warn them that all of this is a lie. Ukrainians have gone through a path that no other country in Europe could endure. Ukrainians accomplished what they couldn't even predict in the Pentagon, stopping and essentially destroying the second largest army in the world. Ukrainians were and remain united even in situations when their most important ally stabs them in the back. And soon there will be another difficult trial. And I really want to believe that this time as well, this nation will demonstrate such strength of spirit that neither Trump nor Putin nor both of them together can break. It will demonstrate it for the sake of those who gave their lives so that the glory of Ukraine would never fade. I was always amazed by the Kremlin's narrative that Ukraine is a failed state. Because it's Russia that's largely responsible for its neighbors' troubles, whether through gas wars, hybrid wars, or full-scale wars. And in this situation, the fact that Ukraine has survived as a sovereign state is already a phenomenon. Just imagine how, in a few centuries, historians will look at all this as they analyze our era. A powerful country with a million-strong army and nuclear weapons attacks a small neighbor who is already exhausted by a hybrid war with that same country. But the aggressor gets hit so hard that in the 21st century, they have to drag donkeys to the front lines. There are no other options because the great country with a great culture has already tried everything, including outright terrorism, striking power plants to leave children and the elderly without heat and light. But the victim of aggression did not give up even after all this.
And here the historian turns the page and next it says, but it was Transnistria that ended up without electricity.
Funny, isn't it? So if we're talking about a failed state, then of course it's not Ukraine. I would say that a failed state is a country that has the entire periodic table of elements in its land, huge reserves of oil and gas, a geographical position that allows it to trade with the world's largest economies, a country that inherited military equipment and nuclear weapons, which allows it not to worry much about security, that received the largest industrial enterprises, a country with an educated population, and a country that prefers, instead of simply developing and getting richer, to start wars, to hate the whole world, and to kill, and kill. That's what a failed state is. Well, as for Ukraine, I'm sure it will still get what it deserves. However, as always, the final word belongs to the common people. As always, it's up to them to decide to be or